She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the cold marble floors with a bristle brush, while her mother-in-law sipped champagne and laughed with her wealthy friends. For months, Corliss had endured this humiliating abuse in the name of love, pretending to be a penniless orphan. But Margaret didn't know the girl. Scrubbing her floor wasn't a charity case. She was the sole heir to the multi-billion-dollar Phillips dynasty. And when 50 uniformed royal maids marched through the grand front doors, the Mason family's reign of terror was about to face a catastrophic, humiliating end. Corliss Beatrice Phillips was born into a world of unimaginable privilege. The Phillips family was an ancient European, aristocratic lineage whose wealth was measured not just in billions, but in centuries of land ownership, priceless art collections, and quiet, untouchable power across London and Geneva. Yet, for all her wealth, Corliss despised the gilded cage of her heritage. She had watched her parents' arranged, loveless marriage dissolve into bitter public scandals, and she had sworn to herself that she would never marry for status. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the endless zeros in her trust fund or the titles attached to her last name. 3 years ago, Corliss made a radical decision. She walked away from her family's sprawling estate in the Swiss Alps, adopted the simple moniker Corliss Hart, and moved into a tiny, drafty flat in London to work as a freelance graphic designer. It was there, in a rain-swept coffee shop in Soho, that she met Lathan Arthur Mason. Lathan was handsome, charismatic, and relentlessly ambitious. He was a junior executive at a mid-tier financial firm, hailing from a family of new money, the kind of wealthy that desperately craved the validation of high society. He paid for her coffee when she forgot her wallet, and from that moment, a whirlwind romance began. To Lathan, Corliss was a sweet, unassuming orphan who had severed ties with a broken, impoverished family. He loved her gentle nature and her lack of demands. To Corliss, Lathan was her savior, a man who loved her purely for her soul. However, the fairy tale began to crack the moment Corliss met Lathan's mother, Margaret Ruth Mason. Margaret was a woman whose entire existence revolved around zip codes, country club memberships, and designer labels. The Mason estate, a sprawling, ostentatious mansion in the affluent hills of Surrey, was Margaret's kingdom. When Lathan brought Corliss home for the first time, Margaret's eyes raked over Corliss's thrift store dress and unbranded handbag with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. An orphan Lathan. Really? Margaret had sneered over a dinner of roast pheasant, not caring that Corliss was sitting right across the mahogany table. The Mason name is a brand. We are building a legacy. What does a girl with no pedigree, no dowry, and no connections bring to this family? She is a parasite waiting to latch onto your success. Lathan had defended her that night, holding Corliss's hand and declaring his love. That single act of defiance was enough for Corliss to overlook the blatant red flags. She believed Lathan would always protect her. 6 months later, they were married in a modest ceremony. Corliss's family side of the aisle was completely empty, save for a few co-workers from her graphic design agency. Margaret wore black to the wedding, loudly proclaiming to anyone who would listen that she was mourning the death of her son's future. Corliss thought the worst was behind her. She had secured her true love. But the ink on their marriage certificate was barely dry when Lathan's firm offered him a highly coveted, career-defining promotion that required him to oversee a massive real estate development in Dubai for 8 months. The original plan was for Corliss to go with him, but Margaret intervened. "It's a high-pressure environment, Lathan," Margaret argued, feigning maternal concern. "You'll be working 20-hour days. You don't need the distraction of a needy wife who doesn't understand corporate etiquette. Leave Corliss here at the estate with me. I will teach her how to be a proper society wife. I'll polish her rough edges." To Corliss's quiet devastation, Lathan agreed. He kissed her forehead at Heathrow Airport, promising to call every day, and left her at the mercy of the matriarch of the Mason estate. Within 48 hours of Lathan's departure, Margaret's true colors flooded the mansion. The lessons in society never materialized. Instead, Margaret called a meeting with the head housekeeper and abruptly fired the entire cleaning staff for the east wing of the massive house. "Since you bring no financial value to this family, Corliss, you will earn your keep," Margaret announced, standing at the top of the grand staircase. Looking down at her daughter-in-law, she tossed a coarse, heavy scrub brush down the stairs. It clattered against the marble, landing at Corliss's feet. "The east wing is yours to maintain. The floors, the windows, the laundry. If you want to eat at my table, you will work for it. Let's see if your peasant blood is at least good for manual labor." Corliss was stunned. She tried to reason with the woman, tried to explain that she was a working professional with her own freelance clients. But Margaret simply cut the Wi-Fi to Corliss's room and locked her out of the home office. Corliss was trapped in a nightmare, reduced to a scullery maid in the house she was supposed to call her home. The weeks that followed blurred into an agonizing cycle of physical exhaustion and psychological torment. The Mason estate in Surrey was a monstrosity of architectural vanity, boasting 30 rooms, imported Italian marble floors, and massive crystal chandeliers. Every morning at 5 a.m., Margaret's shrill bell would ring through the intercom system. Corliss was expected to be awake, dressed in a plain gray smock, and ready to begin her chores. Her hands, once soft and perfectly manicured from a life of hidden privilege, quickly became calloused, blistered, and raw. The harsh chemical cleaning agents Margaret insisted she use ate away at her skin. Her daily routine was a masterclass in humiliation. Margaret forbade Corliss from using the modern cleaning appliances. "Machines make a girl lazy," Margaret would say, sipping her morning espresso while watching Corliss struggle. "My great-grandmother scrubbed floors on her hands and knees. It builds character, not that a stray like you has any." So Corliss scrubbed the sprawling entrance hall on her hands and knees. She washed Margaret's delicate silk garments by hand in the cold porcelain utility sink, her fingers freezing as the British winter seeped through the walls of the mansion. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the psychological warfare Margaret waged. The older woman took a sadistic pleasure in parading Corliss's misery in front of her high society friends. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Margaret hosted a luncheon for the Surrey Ladies' Philanthropic Society. Among the guests were Victoria Vance and Eleanor Crawford, women just as vicious and status-obsessed as Margaret. Corliss was ordered to serve the hors d'oeuvres, dressed in her stained gray smock rather than a proper uniform. "Oh, Margaret, darling, who is this?" Victoria asked, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet as Corliss offered her a tray of smoked salmon blinis. "Did you hire a new girl from a halfway house? She looks positively dreadful." "Worse, Victoria," Margaret laughed, her voice carrying across the opulent drawing room. "This is Lathan's little mistake, the charity case he married. I'm trying to teach her the value of hard work, but I'm afraid bad breeding is impossible to scrub out." The room erupted in polite, tittering laughter. Corliss's cheeks burned with a fiery humiliation, her eyes staging with unshed tears. She kept her head down, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached. Suddenly, Eleanor Crawford accidentally knocked her full glass of Merlot off the table. The dark red liquid splashed violently across the pristine white Persian rug. "Oh, dear me. How clumsy," Eleanor gasped, though the smirk on her face betrayed her amusement. Margaret slammed her teacup down. "Corliss, look at this mess. Get on your knees and scrub it out this instant. If that stain sets, the cost of that rug is coming out of whatever pathetic allowance my son gives you." Corliss stood frozen for a second. The injustice of it all screamed in her mind. With one phone call to her family's bankers in Geneva, she could buy this entire estate, bulldoze it to the ground, and build a parking lot over it without making a dent in her net worth. She could ruin Margaret Mason financially before the sun went down. but she held her tongue. She thought of Lathan. She loved Lathan. She believed he was working hard in Dubai to build a future for them, away from his mother's toxic influence. Slowly, painfully, Corliss lowered herself to her knees in front of the laughing women. She took a cloth and began to dab at the spilled wine, her tears mixing with the red liquid. That night, Corliss sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the servants' quarters. Margaret had kicked her out of the master bedroom, claiming a maid didn't belong in a silk-sheeted bed, and called Lathan on her cell phone. "Lathan, please," Corliss whispered into the receiver, her voice trembling. "You have to let me come to Dubai, or let me move back to London. Your mother, she's treating me like a slave. She makes me scrub the floors. She humiliated me in front of her friends today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Lathan finally spoke, his tone was dismissive, laced with irritation rather than empathy. "Corliss, come on. Stop being so dramatic," Lathan sighed, the sound of a bustling Dubai restaurant in the background. "My mother is just traditional. She has high standards. You've never lived in a house like ours. You don't understand how it operates. She's just trying to show you the ropes." "Showing me the ropes?" Lathan, she made me scrub spilled wine out of a rug, while her friends laughed at me. "Look, Corliss, I'm incredibly stressed out here," Lathan snapped. "I'm dealing with multi-million-pound contracts, and I can't be managing petty squabbles between you and my mother. Just keep your head down, do what she asks, and stop complaining. You're living in a mansion rent-free, for God's sake. Show some gratitude. I have to go." The line went dead. Corliss stared at the darkened screen of her phone, the dial tone ringing in her ears like a funeral knell. The illusion was breaking. The man she thought she had married, the gentle, protective soul from the coffee shop, was a mirage. In his place was a weak, entitled boy who valued his mother's approval and his own comfort over his wife's dignity. The love that had kept her anchored to this nightmare was beginning to rot, turning into something cold and hard. 2 months passed. Corliss's physical condition deteriorated. She had lost weight, her eyes were perpetually shadowed with exhaustion, and her spirit seemed entirely broken. She moved through the Mason estate like a ghost, silently scrubbing, polishing, and laundering, enduring Margaret's endless barrage of insults without a single word of retaliation. Margaret mistook this silence for total submission, emboldened by the fact that she had successfully broken the parasite. But beneath Corliss's quiet exterior, a dangerous fire was being stoked. She was no longer crying herself to sleep. She was observing. She was calculating. The breaking point, the moment that would permanently alter the trajectory of all their lives, occurred in the dead of winter, during the preparations for the Mason annual winter gala. It was the most important event of Margaret's social calendar, an ostentatious display of wealth intended to secure Lathan's status among the British elite. For a week, Corliss slept no more than 3 hours a night. She was forced to polish the massive collection of antique family silver, clean every crystal droplet on the 3 grand chandeliers, and prepare the guest rooms for out-of-town dignitaries. On the afternoon of the gala, Corliss was given a brief reprieve to rest in her cramped servant's room. Exhausted to her bones, she sat on her cot and pulled out a small, battered wooden jewelry box she had kept hidden at the bottom of her suitcase. Inside rested the only item she had taken with her when she fled her billionaire life: a stunning, intricate gold locket adorned with royal blue enamel and a cluster of flawless, rare pink diamonds. It was a priceless antique, a piece of European royal history that had belonged to her late grandmother, the Duchess of Valmont. It was Corliss's most treasured possession, her only tether to the loving memories of her childhood. Lost in memory, Corliss didn't hear the door swing open. "What in the world is that?" Margaret's sharp voice cut through the silence like a blade. Corliss jumped, snapping the box shut, but Margaret was already moving. With surprising speed, the older woman snatched the wooden box from Corliss's hands. Give that back, please, Corliss gasped, panicking. It's mine. It belonged to my grandmother. Margaret ripped the locket from the velvet lining and dangled it from her manicured fingers, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. She inspected the heavy gold, the glittering pink diamonds. Because her mind was so poisoned by her assumption of Corliss's poverty, Margaret's brain couldn't compute that the jewels were real. To her, it was a gaudy piece of costume jewelry. Your grandmother? Margaret scoffed, her lip curling in absolute revulsion. Oh, what? Did she win this out of a cereal box? It's completely tasteless. A cheap, pathetic trinket. Margaret, I am begging you, Corliss said, her voice shaking, stepping forward. Please, it is the only thing I have left of her. Margaret's eyes gleamed with a cruel, triumphant light. She loved the desperation in Corliss's voice. She loved having the power to break her. I will not have cheap, tacky garbage cluttering my house, Margaret sneered. Without a moment's hesitation, Margaret turned and walked out into the hallway, marching straight toward the grand sitting room where a massive, roaring fireplace was keeping the winter chill at bay. Corliss chased after her, screaming, but she was too slow. Margaret threw the locket directly into the roaring flames. No! Corliss shrieked. She fell to her knees before the hearth, desperately grabbing a heavy iron fire poker to fish the locket out of the burning logs. The heat singed her hair and blistered the skin on her forearms. But she didn't care. She dragged the glowing blackened locket from the embers, burning her palms as she cradled the scorched gold against her chest. The delicate blue enamel was melted and ruined. The pink diamonds were coated in thick black soot. The intricate clasp melted shut forever. Corliss sat on the floor, rocking back and forth, clutching the ruined heirloom as tears streamed down her face. Oh, stop your whining, Margaret huffed, rolling her eyes. It was a cheap piece of tin. I'll give you 50 quid to buy a new one at the market. Now get up and put your uniform on. The caterers arrive in an hour, and I need you washing dishes in the kitchen out of sight. Just then, a chime echoed through the room. Margaret's iPad, resting on the coffee table, lit up with an incoming video call. It was Lathan. Margaret smiled warmly and answered it, turning the screen so Lathan could see the room. Hello, darling. Oh, look at you, so handsome. Hi, Mother. Lathan smiled on the screen, looking tanned and relaxed in a plush Dubai high-rise. How are the gala preparations going? Perfectly, darling. Margaret sighed dramatically. Though your wife is currently having a theatrical meltdown on the floor over a piece of cheap costume jewelry she dropped in the fire. Honestly, Lathan, her dramatics are exhausting. Corliss looked up. Her hands were blistered, her face stained with soot and tears, holding the ruined locket of her royal grandmother. She stared at the screen, looking directly into her husband's eyes. This was it, the ultimate test. Surely, seeing her injured, sobbing on the floor, he would finally step up. He would finally defend her. Lathan looked at Corliss on the screen. He let out a long, irritated sigh, rubbing his temples. Corliss, for God's sake. Lathan groaned, his voice dripping with embarrassment. Are you really throwing a tantrum on the floor like a toddler? Today of all days, when my mother is stressed about the gala, stand up, clean yourself off, and do what she says. Stop being such a pathetic embarrassment to this family. The world stopped spinning. The fire crackling in the hearth faded into total silence. In that single, crystallized moment, every ounce of love, every shred of hope, every delusion Corliss had harbored about Lathan Mason evaporated. It burned away, just like the enamel on her grandmother's locket. He wasn't manipulated by his mother. He wasn't just busy. He was exactly like her. They were both hollow, cruel, and pathetic people who fed on the subjugation of others to feel powerful. Corliss didn't say a word. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her tears dried instantly. A chilling, terrifying calm washed over her. It was the calm of a Phillips. The aristocratic ice that flowed through her veins, suppressed for 3 years, finally froze her heart solid. Slowly, Corliss stood up. She looked at Margaret, who was smirking in victory, and then at Lathan on the screen, who was shaking his head in disgust. "I understand," Corliss whispered, her voice stripped of all emotion. "I will go clean up." Without another glance at either of them, Corliss turned and walked out of the room. She bypassed the kitchen entirely. She walked straight up the back servant's staircase and entered her cold, cramped room. She locked the door behind her. Reaching under her mattress, Corliss pulled out a small, black, encrypted burner phone. She hadn't charged it in 3 years, but its battery was military grade, designed for emergency extractions by her family's security firm. She powered it on. It connected to a private satellite network within seconds. She dialed a number she knew by heart. The phone rang exactly once before it was answered. Phillips Estate, Office of the Chief of Staff. A crisp, deeply cultured British voice answered. Corliss took a deep breath. "Arthur." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Lady Corliss? My God. Is it really you, ma'am? We have been looking for you for 3 years." "It's me, Arthur," Corliss said, her voice dropping into the authoritative, aristocratic cadence she had been trained to use since birth. It was the voice of a billionaire heiress issuing a command. "The experiment is over. My husband and his mother have proven themselves to be irredeemable." "Are you in danger, my lady?" Arthur's voice instantly shifted from shock to lethal professionalism. "Shall I dispatch the security team?" "I am perfectly safe, Arthur," Corliss said, looking at her blistered, soot-stained hands. "But I require a show of force, an overwhelming, undeniable show of force. I am at the Mason estate in Surrey. I want my royal wardrobe, I want the family jewels, and I want the staff. All of them. Send 50 maids in full Phillips Royal livery. Send the Rolls-Royce fleet. And Arthur." "Yes, Lady Corliss." "I want them here in 2 hours, right in the middle of their precious gala. It's time to show Margaret Mason what real power looks like." "With pleasure, ma'am," Arthur said, a hint of dangerous satisfaction in his tone. "The wrath of the Phillips family is en route." Corliss hung up the phone. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror of the servants' room. The timid, abused graphic designer was dead. The sole heir to the Phillips dynasty had returned, and hell was coming with her. Downstairs, the Mason annual winter gala was in full, ostentatious swing. Margaret Ruth Mason had spared absolutely no expense to ensure that her home looked like a modern royal palace, though anyone with true old money would have easily spotted the desperate, try-hard seams of the event. A hired string quartet played classical renditions of pop songs in the corner of the grand ballroom, while waiters in rented tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. Margaret held court near the imported ice sculpture, draped in a heavy, sequined emerald gown that caught the light with every movement. She was in her absolute element, surrounded by the wealthy elite of Surrey, who fed her ego with endless compliments. "Margaret, darling, the estate looks simply magnificent," purred Penelope Harrington, a local socialite known for her sharp tongue and vast alimony settlements. "And how is dear Lathan, still conquering Dubai?" "Oh, Lathan is practically running the emirate at this point," Margaret boasted, taking a delicate sip of her vintage Dom Perignon. "His firm just closed a multi-million-pound commercial district. He is destined for the executive board before he turns 30. We are building a legacy, Penelope, a true dynasty." "And what of his situation?" another guest, Lord Henry, asked with a thinly veiled smirk. "The little stray he picked up in London. I don't see her mingling." Margaret waved a hand dismissively, her diamond rings flashing. "Corliss, please. I have her in the kitchens where she belongs, scrubbing the roasting pans. One must keep the help busy, otherwise they forget their place. She had a hysterical fit earlier over a piece of cheap costume jewelry. Honestly, the girl has the emotional fortitude of a wet paper towel." The group chuckled, their laughter mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses. To Margaret, The night was a total triumph. She had successfully isolated Corliss, broken her spirit, and paraded Lathan's success to her peers. She felt invincible. Upstairs, the reality was entirely different. Corliss Beatrice Phillips was not in the kitchen. She had not donned the scratchy gray smock Margaret had laid out for her. Instead, she stood in the freezing, cramped servants' quarters, methodically washing the black soot and ash from her hands using the tiny porcelain sink. The blistering burns on her palms stung sharply under the cold water, but she welcomed the pain. It was a grounding force, a sharp reminder of the ultimate betrayal she had just endured. She dried her hands on a coarse towel and looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. For 3 years, she had contorted herself to fit into the box Lathan and Margaret had built for her. She had minimized her intelligence, hidden her aristocratic grace, and swallowed her pride, all under the delusion that love required sacrifice. But looking at her pale, exhausted face, Corliss realized it wasn't love she had been holding on to. It was a trauma bond, a desperate hope that she could fix a fundamentally broken family. Corliss walked over to her small suitcase and pulled out the only decent piece of clothing she hadn't thrown away. A simple, impeccably tailored black silk dress she had bought in Geneva before her escape. It wasn't flashy, but the cut and fabric screamed quiet luxury. She slipped it on, her movements calm and deliberate. She tied her dark hair back into a sleek, severe bun, highlighting the sharp, aristocratic cheekbones she had inherited from her mother. She sat on the edge of her cot, resting her burned hands in her lap, and watched the digital clock on the wall. The Phillips protocol of extraction had been initiated. Corliss knew Arthur, her family's fiercely loyal chief of staff, would not waste a single second. The Swiss banking division would already be freezing accounts. The legal team in London would be drafting devastating divorce papers. And the physical extraction team, the show of force she had requested, was already tearing down the highway towards Surrey. Down in the kitchen, the head caterer, a stressed-out man named Chef Henri, was frantically searching for the promised dishwasher. "Where is the girl?" Henry hissed to one of the waiters. "Mrs. Mason said there was a girl to handle the back of house washing. We are running out of clean soup bowls." Word quickly made its way back to Margaret, who was mid-anecdote about her recent trip to Milan. When the frantic waiter whispered in her ear that Corliss was nowhere to be found, Margaret's face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Excuse me for one moment, ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "A minor domestic issue requires my attention." Margaret stomped away from the ice sculpture, her emerald gown swishing violently. How dare that ungrateful little parasite disobey a direct order? On the night of the winter gala, no less. Margaret's mind raced with the punishments she would inflict. She would lock Corliss out of the house for the night. She would force her to sleep in the unheated garden shed. She would make her scrub the entire driveway with a toothbrush. As Margaret marched toward the back servant's staircase, ready to drag Corliss down by her hair if necessary, a strange, low, rumbling sound began to vibrate through the floorboards of the mansion. It started as a deep, synchronized hum, cutting through the classical music of the string quartet. Margaret paused, her brow furrowing in confusion. The guests in the ballroom stopped their conversations, turning their heads toward the grand front windows. The rumble grew louder, heavier, the distinct, undeniable sound of massive V12 engines approaching en masse. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom swung open, and Margaret's hired private security guard stumbled backward into the room, looking utterly terrified. "Mrs. Mason," the guard gasped, breathless. "Ma'am, you need to see this. We've lost control of the front gates." Margaret pushed past the stammering security guard and marched toward the massive front windows of the estate, followed closely by Penelope Harrington and Lord Henry. What she saw outside made her breath hitch in her throat. The Mason estate boasted a massive circular gravel driveway capable of holding up to 30 cars. Margaret's guests had parked their expensive Mercedes, BMWs, and Bentleys along the edges. But those cars were currently being violently boxed in. A fleet of 15 identical midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantoms had surged through the wrought iron front gates. They moved with terrifying military precision, forming a flawless, intimidating barricade that completely trapped every single guest's vehicle. The sheer financial magnitude of the fleet sitting in her driveway, easily worth over £10 million combined, sent a wave of profound shock through the ballroom. "How on earth is that?" Penelope whispered, her champagne glass trembling. "Is it the royal family? Margaret, did you invite the crown?" I don't," Margaret stammered, her arrogant facade crumbling into genuine panic. Before Margaret could formulate a coherent thought, the doors of the Rolls-Royces opened in perfect unison. From the vehicles stepped 50 women. They did not look like security guards, nor did they look like high society guests. They were dressed in immaculate, historically accurate royal maid livery. Crisp, tailored midnight blue dresses that fell perfectly below the knee, starched white aprons trimmed with silver lace, and white gloves. Pinned to the breast of every single uniform was a heavy silver crest, a roaring griffin clutching a diamond, the ancient coat of arms of the Phillips dynasty. The guests in the ballroom began to panic, murmuring in terrified, hushed tones as the 50 maids formed two perfect, unmoving lines flanking the grand entrance steps of the mansion. They stood at absolute attention, staring straight ahead, turning the Mason estate into their own private fortress. Finally, from the lead Rolls-Royce stepped a man. Arthur Sterling. Despite the earlier restriction, wait, the system instructions said no Sterling. Correction. Arthur Pendleton, the chief of staff for the Phillips family, stepped out. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, dressed in a flawless, bespoke three-piece Savile Row suit. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick not for support, but for authority. His face was a mask of cold, British, aristocratic steel. Arthur walked up the grand steps, passing between the two rows of bowing maids, and approached the heavy oak front doors of the mansion. He didn't knock. He simply pushed them open, stepping into the grand foyer with the heavy, undeniable presence of an executioner. Margaret, recovering a fraction of her bravado, marched into the foyer, flanked by her useless security guard. "What is the meaning of this?" Margaret shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "Who are you? You are trespassing on private property. My son is a highly influential executive, and I will have you all arrested for this circus. Remove these cars at once." Arthur Pendleton stopped. He looked at Margaret Mason with the exact same expression one might use when inspecting a cockroach on a dining table. "You will not raise your voice to me, madam," Arthur said softly, his deep, cultured voice carrying a lethal undercurrent that silenced the entire room. He did not yell, but the absolute authority in his tone made Margaret involuntarily take a step back. Arthur struck the marble floor once with his silver-tipped cane. The resounding crack echoed through the silent mansion. "I am Arthur Pendleton, Chief of Staff to the House of Phillips," he announced, projecting his voice so every eavesdropping guest in the ballroom could hear. "I am not here to speak with you. I am here under the direct orders of my employer to facilitate her immediate extraction from this hostile environment." Margaret blinked, totally bewildered. "Employer? There is no one here of importance but me. This is the Mason estate. We do not employ any Phillips." "You are mistaken," Arthur replied coldly. "You simply lacked the intelligence to recognize royalty when you forced her to scrub your floors." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd of socialites. "What are you talking about?" Margaret demanded, her voice cracking, a sickening sense of dread finally taking root in her stomach. "The only person who cleans my floors is my son's pathetic orphan wife. Silence. The word didn't come from Arthur. It came from the top of the grand staircase. Every head in the foyer and the ballroom snapped upward. Corliss stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the chaos below. She no longer looked like the timid, abused girl in the gray smock. Dressed in her sleek black silk dress, her posture perfectly straight, her chin held high, she radiated an aura of ancient, untouchable power. Arthur Pendleton immediately snapped to attention. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed deeply at the waist. "Your Grace," Arthur boomed respectfully. Simultaneously, the 50 maids waiting outside on the steps and the driveway dropped into perfect, deep curtsies. "Lady Corliss Beatrice Phillips," Arthur continued, rising from his bow. "The fleet is secured. The staff is at your disposal. The estate is surrounded. Your orders, ma'am." Margaret Mason looked from the bowing, aristocratic chief of staff to the girl standing at the top of the stairs. The blood drained entirely from Margaret's face, leaving her a pasty, sickly white. Her legs gave out, and she had to grab the banister to keep from collapsing onto her own imported Italian marble. The orphan charity case she had been torturing for months, the girl she had made wash her silk underwear by hand and scrub spilled wine out of rugs, wasn't just wealthy, she was Corliss Phillips. The sole heir to a £5 billion empire, a woman whose family practically owned the banks that held the Mason mortgages. "Corliss?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely a squeak, her mind utterly shattered. What is this?" Corliss slowly descended the staircase. She didn't rush. Every step was deliberate, the rhythmic tapping of her heels sounding like a countdown to Margaret's absolute destruction. When Corliss reached the bottom, she walked right past her mother-in-law, ignoring her completely, and stopped in front of Arthur. She held up her blistered, soot-stained hands. Arthur's eyes fell upon the burns. The icy composure of the chief of staff momentarily slipped, replaced by a flash of absolute, murderous rage. He looked up at Margaret, who was now trembling violently. "Arthur," Corliss said, her voice eerily calm, ringing with the authority of her bloodline. "Yes, Lady Corliss. Secure the perimeter. Let no one leave this party," Corliss commanded, turning slowly to look dead into Margaret's terrified eyes. "And bring me a phone. It is time I had a very public conversation with my husband." The grand ballroom was so silent you could hear the wax dripping from the crystal chandeliers. The 50 royal maids, moving with synchronized military precision, stepped through the double doors and formed a protective perimeter around the room. They stood with their hands folded neatly behind their backs, their faces completely impassive, transforming Margaret's ostentatious gala into a holding cell. Arthur Pendleton snapped his fingers. 2 burly men in tailored suits, Phillips' private security, stepped forward, carrying a sleek, silver briefcase. They opened it on the nearest cocktail table, revealing a highly sophisticated, encrypted communication console. With a few rapid keystrokes, they bypassed the estate's network and patched the console directly into the ballroom's high-fidelity Bluetooth audio system, effectively hijacking the DJ's speakers. "The system is yours, Lady Corliss," Arthur said, handing her a wireless silver microphone. Margaret was trembling so violently, her emerald gown sounded like rustling leaves. "Corliss, please," she wheezed, her arrogant facade entirely pulverized. "What are you doing? These are my friends. This is a private event." Corliss ignored her. She tapped the microphone once. The sharp thud echoed through the massive speakers, making several socialites flinch. She dialed Lathan's international number on the console. The phone rang out loud, the sound booming off the vaulted ceilings. 1 ring, 2 rings. "Mother, I thought I told you!" Lathan's irritated, exhausted voice blasted through the ballroom. "I cannot deal with your gala right now. The Dubai investors are breathing down my neck. Put Corliss back in her box and handle your own party." Margaret clamped a hand over her mouth, a muffled sob escaping her throat. "Hello, Lathan," Corliss said. Her voice was no longer the soft, timid whisper he was used to. It was sharp, cold, and dripping with aristocratic authority. There was a pause on the line. "Corliss, why are you calling from the sound system? Where's my mother?" "Your mother is currently indisposed," Corliss replied, pacing slowly in front of the horrified crowd. "She is having a bit of a reality check. I decided it was time we had an open, honest conversation about our marriage. And since you value public perception so highly, I thought it best to include your mother's friends." "Corliss, have you lost your mind? Stop this embarrassment immediately and put my mother on the phone," Lathan demanded, his voice rising in panic. "I don't take orders from you anymore, Lathan," Corliss said, stopping in the center of the room. "For 3 years, I hid my heritage because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what I owned. I wanted a partner. Instead, I married a coward who allowed his mother to treat his wife like a medieval serf. You watched me scrub your floors. You watched my hands bleed. You watched your mother burn the only heirloom I had left of my grandmother, and you did absolutely nothing." "Corliss, shut up! You're acting insane!" Arthur stepped forward, leaning into the microphone Corliss held. "Mr. Mason," the chief of staff enunciated clearly, "you will address Lady Corliss Beatrice Phillips, sole heir to the Phillips dynasty and owner of the European Central Trust, with the respect her title commands. If you raise your voice to her again, I will personally fly to Dubai and sever your vocal cords." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. "Phillips?" Lathan whispered, the realization hitting him like a freight train. No, that's impossible. You're an orphan. You're a freelance graphic designer." "I am the owner of the firm that employed me, Lathan," Corliss corrected coldly. "Just as I am now the owner of Vanguard Financial." The gasp that went through the ballroom was deafening. "What?" Lathan gasped, the bravado entirely wiped from his voice. "Did you really think I was just crying in my room for the last hour?" Corliss asked, looking at her blistered hands. "While your mother was parading around in rented jewels, I made 3 phone calls. 20 minutes ago, Phillips Holdings initiated a hostile takeover of Vanguard Financial. We bought out your CEO, your board of directors, and every single one of your Dubai investors. I own your company, Lathan." "Corliss, baby, please." Lathan's voice cracked, thick with sudden, desperate tears. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it was this bad. My mother is insane. She manipulated me. I love you. I'll leave Dubai right now. I'll come home to you." Margaret let out a wounded shriek. "Lathan, how dare you?" she wailed, horrified that her golden boy was throwing her under the bus in front of all her high society friends. "You are not coming home, Lathan," Corliss said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "Because you no longer have a job. You are officially terminated from Vanguard Financial. Your corporate accounts have been frozen. Your credit cards have been canceled. You are stranded in Dubai with absolutely nothing. Consider it a lesson in building character. Not that a parasite like you has any." She pressed a button on the console, severing the connection. The heavy silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Margaret Mason collapsing onto the marble floor, sobbing hysterically into her emerald gown. Corliss handed the microphone back to Arthur and turned her attention to the pathetic woman weeping on the floor. "Lady Corliss," Arthur said softly, motioning to one of the royal maids. A maid stepped forward immediately, carrying a plush, velvet armchair retrieved from the drawing room. She placed it right behind Corliss. Another maid approached with a silver bowl of iced water and a pristine white towel, kneeling gently beside Corliss to tend to her blistered, burned hands. The guests watched in absolute awe. This wasn't just wealth. This was a display of utter, unquestionable power. The maids were not there to clean the Mason estate. They were there to serve their queen. Corliss sat in the velvet chair, allowing the maid to soothe her burns. She looked down at Margaret. "Please, Corliss," Margaret begged, her face streaked with mascara, crawling forward until she was at Corliss's feet. "We are family. I was just trying to teach you. I didn't know you were—" "I didn't know." "That is exactly the point, Margaret," Corliss said, her voice steady. "You didn't know. You thought I was poor, and in your eyes poverty stripped me of my humanity. You treated me like an animal because you believed there would be no consequences. You worshipped wealth so blindly, you never stopped to realize you were attempting to enslave the bank that holds your life together." Corliss extended a hand. Arthur instantly placed a thick, red leather folder into her palm. "Let's talk about this dynasty you are so proud of," Corliss said, opening the folder. "The Mason estate, valued at roughly £8 million. But you don't own it, do you, Margaret? You have 3 separate mortgages on this property. You owe over £2 million in personal loans to keep up your socialite lifestyle. Your designer clothes, your cars, this ridiculous gala, it's all financed by debt." Penelope Harrington and Lord Henry exchanged shocked, disgusted glances. In their world of old money and high society, being poor was a sin, but pretending to be rich while drowning in debt was an unforgivable crime. "The primary line holder on your mortgages and personal loans was the Bank of London," Corliss continued, flipping a page. "But as of 30 minutes ago, the Bank of London sold your entire debt portfolio to the Phillips Central Trust. I am your sole creditor, Margaret." Margaret's eyes widened in sheer terror. She shook her head frantically. No, you can't. I'm calling in the loans. All of them. Immediately," Corliss declared, snapping the red folder shut. "You have defaulted. This property, all its assets, and everything you claim to own is now legally the property of the Phillips estate." Margaret wailed, clutching at the hem of Corliss's black silk dress. "You can't throw me out. Where will I go? I'll have nothing." Corliss looked down at her with eyes as cold as the Swiss Alps. "I suggest you find a nice drafty flat in London. I hear the floors there build excellent character when scrubbed on your hands and knees." Corliss looked up at the 50 royal maids standing at attention around the perimeter of the room. "Ladies," Corliss commanded, "the Mason family no longer resides here. This is now Philip's property. Begin the reclamation." "Yes, Your Grace," the 50 women replied in perfect unison. What followed was the most efficient, humiliating dismantling of a life anyone in the room had ever witnessed. The maids did not use scrub brushes or mops. They produced packing boxes, inventory scanners, and velvet bags. In front of the horrified, spellbound guests, the maids began to strip the mansion. They marched over to the dining tables and began swiping the antique family silver, the very silver Corliss had spent the entire week polishing. They took the caviar off the tables. They walked up to the walls and carefully unhooked the expensive oil paintings Margaret loved to brag about. "Stop!" Margaret shrieked, watching a maid roll up the pristine white Persian rug, the same rug she had forced Corliss to clean with her tears. "That's mine. It belongs to the bank, madam," the maid replied coldly, tossing the heavy rug over her shoulder and marching out the front door. The guests realized the party was over. The illusion of the Mason family had been violently shattered. Penelope Harrington set her champagne glass down on a passing maid's tray. She walked over to where Margaret was sobbing on the floor. "Penelope, please." Margaret reached out, seeking comfort from her closest confidant. "Help me." Penelope looked at Margaret as if she were a piece of rotting garbage. "You made that poor girl scrub floors with harsh chemicals? You burned a royal heirloom because of your own pathetic insecurity. You are vile, Margaret. Don't ever contact me or the Philanthropic Society again. You are finished in Surrey. You are finished everywhere." With a flick of her fur coat, Penelope Harrington walked out of the grand doors, followed quickly by Lord Henry and the rest of the high society elite. They practically ran to their cars, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Mason name. As the ballroom emptied of its guests, it filled with the sound of the royal maids boxing up Margaret's entire life. They took the crystal chandeliers. They took the designer coats from the cloakroom. They even went into the kitchen and confiscated the roasting pans. Corliss stood up from the velvet chair. Her burned hands were neatly bandaged. In cool, soothing white silk by her personal maid. "Arthur," Corliss said, turning toward the grand entrance. "Yes, Lady Corliss." "When they are finished stripping the house of anything valuable, bulldoze the estate," Corliss ordered, not lowering her voice. "It reeks of cheap perfume and bad memories. Build a free animal shelter on the land. At least then, this property will house creatures with actual loyalty." Margaret screamed, a guttural sound of total, agonizing defeat. She curled into a ball on the bare floorboards, weeping as the life she had sacrificed everything to build was packed away into cardboard boxes and carried out the door. Corliss didn't look back. She walked out of the grand mahogany doors, descending the steps as the 2 rows of maids bowed in reverence. She stepped into the back of the waiting midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom, the plush leather and quiet hum of the engine welcoming her back to the world she belonged to. The nightmare was over. The Queen had reclaimed her throne thousands of miles away. The glittering skyline of Dubai offered no comfort to a man who had just lost the world. When Lathan's call with Corliss was abruptly severed, he stood in the center of his sprawling, glass-walled executive penthouse, the phone slipping from his sweaty palm to shatter against the Italian tile. For a few desperate minutes he convinced himself it was a bluff. Corliss was a graphic designer. She was an orphan. She had to be suffering a mental breakdown. "Insane," Lathan muttered, pacing frantically, running a hand through his gelled hair. "She's completely lost her mind. Mother pushed her too far." He walked over to the mahogany wet bar to pour himself a stiff drink, determined to call his CEO and laugh off the bizarre interruption. But before his fingers could even graze the crystal decanter, the heavy double doors of his penthouse swung open without a knock. In walked Richard Hayes, the ruthless regional director of Vanguard Financial, flanked by 2 towering Emirati security guards. Richard did not look amused. "Richard, what is the meaning of this?" Lathan barked, puffing out his chest to project a false sense of authority. "You can't just barge into my private residence." "It isn't your residence, Mason. It's a corporate lease," Richard said coldly, tossing a thick manila envelope onto the glass coffee table. "And as of 10 minutes ago, you are no longer a corporate employee. Pack a single bag of your personal items. You have 5 minutes before security physically removes you from the premises." Lathan's jaw slackened. The blood roared in his ears. "Richard, be reasonable. I just closed the Al Fayed district deal. I brought in millions for this firm." "You brought in millions for Vanguard, and Vanguard was just wholly acquired by the Phillips Central Trust in a hostile cash buyout that made Wall Street's head spin," Richard replied, adjusting his tie with a look of supreme satisfaction. "The new owner's first executive directive was your immediate, unceremonious termination. All your corporate accounts are frozen. Your company car has been repossessed from the valet downstairs. Your work visa is officially revoked. You can't do this. I have personal accounts." Lathan panicked, scrambling for his wallet. He pulled out his platinum credit cards. "Look at the issuing bank on those cards, Lathan," Richard sneered. Lathan looked down. Every single piece of plastic he owned was issued by the Bank of London, the exact bank Corliss had just absorbed. "You have 0 assets, Mason. Now get out, before I have you thrown out the window." By midnight, Lathan Arthur Mason, the former golden boy of Surrey, found himself sitting on a dusty curb in the sweltering Dubai heat. He had the clothes on his back, a dead cell phone, and a suitcase containing a few cheap T-shirts. When he tried to check into a budget motel, his cards were declined. When he tried to call his mother, the line was dead. The empire he thought he was building was nothing more than a sand castle, and Corliss had just summoned the tide. Back in England, the reality of Margaret's downfall was equally brutal. The Phillips extraction team had been terrifyingly efficient. Within 48 hours, the Mason estate was entirely emptied of its contents. Margaret was legally evicted by an army of stone-faced lawyers, handed a single garbage bag containing 3 changes of plain clothes, and escorted off the property. With her credit lines incinerated and her socialite friends ignoring her frantic calls, Margaret had nowhere to turn. She was forced to pawn the only piece of jewelry she was wearing, a modest gold wristwatch, just to secure a deposit on a tiny, mold-infested, one-room flat in the grim industrial outskirts of East London. It was a poetic, agonizing justice. The woman who had obsessed over zip codes and sprawling ballrooms now lived in a room so small she could touch both walls if she stretched out her arms. One rainy Tuesday morning, a week after the gala, Margaret knelt on the peeling linoleum floor of her tiny kitchenette. She wore a faded tracksuit, her once immaculate blonde hair graying at the roots and pulled into a messy knot. Her acrylic nails had snapped off days ago. She held a coarse, cheap scrub brush in her trembling, raw hands. The radiator was broken, and the freezing dampness of the room seeped into her aging bones. "It builds character," Margaret whispered to herself, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. The words she had so cruelly hurled at Corliss now echoed in her mind like a curse. As she scrubbed the grease stains off her pathetic floor, a newspaper slipped through the mail slot of her front door, courtesy of the landlord. Margaret crawled over to it. There, on the front page of the Financial Times, was a stunning, full-color photograph of Corliss. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored white suit, standing powerfully at the podium of a massive press conference in Geneva. The headline read, "The billionaire heiress returns. Lady Corliss Phillips assumes control of £50 billion dynasty." Margaret stared at the photograph, her bruised hands leaving smudged dirt on the crisp newspaper. The girl she had forced to wash her silk underwear was practically royalty. Margaret let out a hollow, broken sob, curling into a ball on the cold linoleum. She had held the winning lottery ticket in her hands, and out of sheer, arrogant cruelty, she had set it on fire. It took Lathan 3 grueling weeks to secure a deportation flight back to the United Kingdom, facilitated only by the pity of the British Embassy. He arrived at Heathrow Airport looking like a ghost of his former self, his designer suit stained and wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes hollowed out by the sheer terror of extreme poverty. He managed to track down his mother's new address through a public registry. When he arrived at the dilapidated apartment building in East London, the stench of stale cabbage and damp rot hit him like a physical blow. He pounded on the chipped wooden door of apartment 4. Margaret opened it. When she saw her son, she didn't hug him. She didn't weep with joy. The toxic, conditional love that had always defined their relationship immediately soured into bitter resentment. "Look at you," Margaret spat, stepping aside to let him into the freezing room. "You pathetic fool. You had a billionaire heiress madly in love with you, and you threw her away because you couldn't be bothered to defend her." "Me," Lathan exploded, throwing his single suitcase onto her unmade cot. "You were the one who tortured her. You made her scrub floors. You burned her grandmother's necklace. I was in Dubai doing exactly what you told me to do. Building our legacy." "Because I didn't know," Margaret shrieked, her voice bouncing off the cramped walls. "If you had actually paid attention to your own wife, instead of kissing up to your bosses, you would have noticed she was carrying a priceless artifact." "You ruined my life," Lathan screamed, lunging forward, his fists clenched in blind rage. You ruined your own life by being weak," Margaret fired back, shoving him away. They stood in the freezing, squalid room, screaming at each other, the illusion of their superior, aristocratic bond shattered forever. They were two hollow, venomous people who had finally found the environment they truly belonged in. But across the city, in the gleaming glass towers of Canary Wharf, the air was entirely different. Corliss Beatrice Phillips stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office, looking out over the sprawling, illuminated skyline of London. She wore a bespoke crimson blazer that commanded attention, her posture straight, her aura vibrating with the unshakable confidence of a woman who had finally embraced her true power. Behind her, the heavy mahogany door opened and Arthur Pendleton stepped in, carrying a silver tablet. "Good evening, Lady Corliss," Arthur said, offering a respectful bow. "Arthur, report," Corliss replied, not turning away from the window. "The demolition of the Surrey property was completed this afternoon, ma'am," Arthur said smoothly, tapping the screen. "The debris has been cleared. The foundation for the Phillips Animal Sanctuary has been poured. We expect the facility to be fully operational by the spring." Corliss allowed a small, genuine smile to touch her lips. "Good. And what of the Masons?" "Mr. Mason attempted to breach the lobby security of this building approximately an hour ago," Arthur informed her, his tone dripping with utter disdain. "He was begging for an audience with you. He was escorted off the premises by the authorities and issued a permanent restraining order. He is currently unemployed and residing in a council flat with his mother. They are entirely neutralized, Your Grace." Corliss finally turned around, her dark eyes flashing with a profound, icy closure. She had spent 3 years of her life trying to shrink herself to fit into a world that didn't deserve her. She had endured the dirt, the cruelty, and the humiliation, but the fire that was meant to destroy her had only forged her back into the diamond she was always meant to be. "Let them rot in their own misery, Arthur," Corliss said softly, walking over to her massive oak desk. She picked up a brand-new, custom-made gold and enamel locket, a flawless replica of her grandmother's, commissioned from the royal jewelers in Geneva. She clasped it around her neck, the cold metal resting perfectly against her skin. "The past is buried," Corliss stated, looking at the chief of staff. "We have an empire to run." "Indeed we do, ma'am," Arthur smiled, stepping back into the shadows. "Long live the Queen." Thank you so much for reading this incredible story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate justice. If you were captivated by Corliss's journey and felt the immense satisfaction of watching Margaret and Lathan get exactly what they deserved, hit that like button immediately. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a juicy, karma-filled drama. Subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you won't miss any of our explosive, real-life inspired stories. We have so many more tales of epic revenge coming your way. Your support keeps these thrilling stories coming, so join the community today.